even the Black families who lived in Boston and valued education tried to get out of those schools.
Huh.
And they couldn't because the Boston school committee wouldn't let them transfer. And that's where you get Operation Exodus of Ellen Jackson raising money to bus kids from Roxbury to the South End or other schools. And that's where you get Ruth Batson saying, how do we get our kids into schools in Newton and Brookline? And so there was a real desire among the educated Blacks in the city to do better for their kids. And they tried every means.
And good evening, everybody, and welcome to your library. I'm David Leonard, BPL President and host for our virtual series on the arc of history. The library promotes discourse, lifelong learning, and civic engagement free to all. And tonight's program is the fourth program in this series, where our guest this evening, Farah Stockman, and I will be discussing her work on race, education, desegregation, and the Boston busing crisis. Farah Stockman is an American journalist who has worked for the Boston Globe, currently reports for the New York Times. In 2016, she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in recognition of a series of articles examining the effects of busing on Boston schools. During this talk this evening and conversation, we'll chat about her experiences reporting on busing in Boston, both past impacts and future impacts of this monumental moment in Boston and US history. We're also reminded, of course, that in the current public health crisis of racism, the examination of our roots in history can shed light on today as much as on the past. Farah, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And would you just tell us where you are and maybe something about your background?
Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me at this really important moment to speak about race and education in the United States. I'm here in Cambridge. This is my office. It's a little messy, so pay no attention to the background. Just before we get started, I just wanted to say a few words about four Black women who have changed the landscape of education here in Boston. This is Ellen Jackson. She was the founder of Operation Exodus, which raised private money to bus kids in Roxbury from overcrowded schools to schools in other parts of the city. Ruth Batson. She is a woman who was an early architect of METCO, which was a voluntary busing program that it still exists today, which buses Black kids from Boston to the surrounding suburbs. Jean McGuire, another pioneer. She is the first Black woman to serve on the Boston School Committee, and she really fought for Black teachers to be hired in Boston public schools. And I'm going to add to this list of pioneers, I'm going to add Kim Janey. She's the president of the Boston City Council, but she, for years, fought for equity in schools. And she's the first person to show me this cartoon about the difference between equality in schools and equity. And I just want to say these women were pioneers, they were strategists, they were warriors of sorts. And they fought for Black children in the city to have access to education. And it's important to remember them because the things they fought for have never been fully achieved, but we should remember their names. And I encourage all the listeners to go and look them up because they're really there's a story behind each of these women. And I just want to say, when you all invited me to talk tonight, I had no idea that we would be in this particular moment in history. But I feel like we're in it right now, much to my surprise. We're in this moment of racial reckoning. And so it's really important to look at the past, to look at what went right and what went wrong, and what are our goals today, and to be really clear-eyed about where we're going, because I feel like this is an opportunity, and it's a time when we're seeing companies and powerful individuals acknowledge racism and think about what can be done to move us to a better place. And so I think this is a great time to talk about the subject.
Thanks so much for those opening comments, and also for reminding us of some of the very important figures that are important to more immediate history. I know we want to get to the current moment. The current moment, certainly, while these issues are not new, there certainly appears to be a refreshed interest or appetite for confronting them in new ways. But I wonder if we could, we'll come back to that in a second, but really start with how you got interested in this particular project, which was originally covering aspects of the busing crisis here in Boston, and perhaps some of your personal interest in this story, in this topic, in this issue.
Yep. So it's kind of, I got interested in this topic almost by accident. So in 2014, the Boston City Council passed a symbolic resolution commemorating the 60th anniversary of Brown, the landmark school desegregation case. And it was kind of, it was just marking the 60th anniversary. It was the kind of thing that would never be written about in the press, except that 3 Boston city councilors voted against it. Or no, they didn't vote against it. They voted present. So it was the city councilor from Hyde Park, from East Boston, and from South Boston. And these were, of course, the neighborhoods that were most opposed to busing in the 70s. And so
and this is 2014, right?
This is 2014. And so just to be clear, the city council was commemorating Brown v. Board, which was the 1954 decision that let Linda Brown, a Black girl in Topeka, Kansas, walk down the street to her neighborhood school. But what these city councilors were reacting to was the 1974 Garrity decision, which bused Black children and white children across the city to achieve quote unquote racial balance. And so they were, all these years later in 2014, they voted present instead of voting yes. And I remember calling up Sal LaMattina, the East Boston city councilor at the time, and I said, what is the deal? Why are you, why would you not be in favor of commemorating Brown? And he said, oh, I have nothing against the Brown decision, I support it, but the Garrity decision, the one here in Boston, it caused a lot of turmoil. And he told me that he was a freshman in East Boston when the Garrity decision came down. And he talked about the violence that happened in the schools and people being stabbed in school and his cousins moving away and the political turmoil. And then he said, my best friend back then and even today is a Black guy who got burned out of his house in all of the turmoil around busing. And I said, I thought to myself, like, sure, your best friend was a Black guy back then. Like, it was hard to believe. But it turns out that his dear friend was Robert Lewis Jr., who is a Black leader who runs a youth program in Roxbury. And Robert Lewis Jr. was one of 20 Black families that had moved into East Boston in the Maverick Public Housing Development. And they were going to school in East Boston. In fact, Robert Louis Jr. and Sal LaMattina went to a middle school with a lot of Black kids from Roxbury who were apparently bused from Roxbury to the Donald McKay Middle School back then. And nobody in Eastie shut down the highway over that. So Sal said, what really upset my mom was the idea that I would have to go to Roxbury, maybe to school. And my mother was poor, she didn't have a car. And she was worried that if I got bused to a school in Roxbury and I got in trouble out there, that she wouldn't be able to, help me. And so it was, I call up Robert Louis Jr. then and say, is Sal LaMattina one of your best friends from childhood? And Robert Louis Jr. says, why, yes. And he starts telling me the story of how he was burned out of his home. So essentially, this small experiment in housing integration in East Boston of these Black families in a public housing development sort of ended in failure when the busing crisis happened, because all of these troublemakers in the neighborhood then start throwing fire bombs at these Black families in East Boston. And it was essentially ethnic cleansing. So Robert Louis Jr. moved away, all of the Black families moved away, and Sal and Robert Louis Jr. remained friends. Sal was actually at Robert Louis Jr.'s mother's deathbed in the hospital many years later. And it was an incredible story because Robert Louis Jr.'s mother very much supported busing and Sal's mother opposed it, but these two boys remained friends their whole life until 2014, when Sal votes present at that in that symbolic resolution, and Robert Louis Jr. called him up and chewed him out and said, what the heck? And so, I mean, that whole story just taught me so much. It taught me that this city right now is being led by people who came of age during busing, and their whole worldview is shaped by it, so I better understand it. And it taught me that housing is really important, and one of the reasons that we have such high expectations for our schools to be integrated, and we've bent over backwards, at least in the 70s, to do that, was that our housing was too segregated. And it just taught me there's a lot more complications here. So I spent a year interviewing people about their experiences in 1974, and I learned a lot.
And was this a point where you were freelancing or working for the Globe or the New York Times?
I was a columnist at the Boston Globe at the time.
Okay.
So we wrote a series of columns. Yeah.
And it seems like one of the takeaways, and I think we're going to get a little lesson tonight in legal history around these cases as well. We've touched on Brown versus the Board of Education, which is seminal for this period and for this sector, as well as the Garrity decision. But what's interesting, I think, about the story you just told is that they get bundled together in complicated ways. And so, you then set off on a year-long journey into this topic. Is that right?
Yep. And I interviewed people all around the city. I looked at the police. I looked at basically what happened during that period of time. And I looked at schools in Boston today and whether or not they are any less segregated today than they were in 1973 before the Garrity decision.
Okay. Now, neither of us went to school or grew up in Boston. So does that give us more freedom to look at this a little more objectively, or do we bring our own subjective persona into the mix as well, do you think?
I mean, I think I really felt torn because I didn't grow up in Boston. I grew up in a town called East Lansing, Michigan. It's a college town. A lot of the kids in the high school I went were children of professors. It was an excellent school. And my parents chose that town, and they chose the house where I grew up because it was in walking distance of the elementary school, the middle school, and the high school. Right. And so, they literally made this decision about where I would live based on the idea that I would not have to get on a bus. And so, and yet I should say there's no people that I can think of who have who've lived out the values of integration more than my parents. My mother is a Black woman from Mississippi. She attended segregated schools in Mississippi for her entire life until she went to get a master's degree. My father is a white guy from Pennsylvania who he went to an integrated school in Pennsylvania and he taught at a historically Black college. They were married in 1969. 2 years after the Supreme Court struck down a law that would have made their marriage a crime. So you don't find people that have lived out the values of integration more than my parents. And yet I doubt my parents would have just thrown my education to the total fate of a lottery, of a school lottery. And so I really had to struggle with this notion of, you find a lot of people championing integration, but who don't actually put their own kids in a system that requires you to give up all control over where your child goes to school. And so it was hard for me to sort of square the circle of, do we have public policies that require people to just give up all control over where their children go to school? And essentially what the Garrity decision did was that it elevated this concept of racially integrated schools. But anybody who didn't like the assignment they got, if they were middle class, they could move out of the city or they could go to parochial school. And so people with money had options, they could escape it. And they did. So I think it's just one of the things, it's one of the reality checks that we have to give ourselves. It's one of the hard lessons that we learned in the 70s when you look back at what works and what doesn't work, and why schools today in Boston are arguably as segregated as they were in the early 70s.
Yeah, so we're going to have to come to the question of whether this worked or not, in addition to whether it was well-intentioned. But maybe we go back to what the court case and the Garrity decision ultimately were responding to. Can you give us a little background that leads up to the case itself? And then let's talk through that 1974 position.
Yes. So I just want to, let me step way back.
Okay.
Let me just step way back and say,
we like thinking of this, or we know we have to think of this as a 400-year-old problem in some regard. So feel free to take us back to wherever, to wherever we want to start.
All right. So if you want to go way back, I think one of the reasons this is such an open wound in our society today, not just in Boston, but around the country, is that the story of Black people in this country can really be told through the story of schools. Yeah. And if you think about slavery, it's the absence of schools. If you think about slavery, it's the criminalization of schools. And the fact that across the South, I think Tennessee was the only state that did not criminalize teaching Black children to read and write. When I was doing research for this talk, I found the case of Margaret Douglas, a white woman who she ran a school in Virginia for Black kids. In 1854, she was sent to a jail for a month for teaching Black children. And these are free Black children whose parents were paying her out of their own pocket. So just, that's a place to start. If you think that at the time in the state of Virginia, it was more, you would get more punishment for teaching a Black girl to read than you would if you had raped her.
Incredible.
Just getting your head around that tells you where we were as a country. And then you have emancipation, where you have something like 5 million Black people who are newly freed. By design, they are illiterate. And a lot of them poured into union camps. They were looking for education, for food, for shelter. And then you have this sort of Reconstruction period of flourishing Black education. And you have do-gooding whites coming down from the North, just open schools in the South. And you have Black people with opening schools with what little money they had. And then you had the Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency that basically poured public money for the first time into educating Black people. And you know, this was not without turmoil, right? There were Black schools that were burned. There were teachers that were lynched. This was a fight just to get basic education. And then you have 100-year period of Black schools, essentially, where most Black people in this country were taught in Black schools by Black teachers. Now, that's not the case in Boston, and we can get to that in a minute, because I think in Boston, you had white teachers teaching Black kids. But in the South, that was really the backbone of the Black middle class. So, and this is my family history. My grandfather was the principal of the Tutwiler School for Colors. I think we have a picture of him somewhere here. My grandmother was an English teacher. And these were my mother's parents, and they ran a Black school in Mississippi. And so these were schools that were under-resourced. I think for the last number I saw was that like $13 would be spent on a Black child's education for every 450 that was spent on a white child's education. So they were under-resourced for sure, but these Black schools actually, some of them turned out geniuses, right? Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And if you look at, you know, Fisk University, a Black school, you know, when it started, it had students aged 7 to 70. This is W.E.B. Du Bois, Fisk graduation class of 1888. So, I mean, there's this period of time where Black people were being educated in Black schools, and some of them were islands of excellence. They were really churning out geniuses. And I include my mother among the geniuses that they created. I will just say, I interviewed my mother last week for this talk, and I said, Mom, how were you able to get an education in those segregated Jim Crow schools that prepared you to live in the white world and to teach at a white university? And she said, my teachers believed in me. I had a sense of wholeness. I had a sense of self-worth because of that community. This is my mother in Jackson State, where she went to college. So my mother graduated in 1958 from an all-Black Jim Crow school in Winona, Mississippi. And she was a valedictorian. She had won oratory contests. And so she, you know, poor as those schools were, they imbued a lot of people with a sense of self-worth that I think that is the reason I'm hitting hard on this point, is because when we enter the next period, which is the period of integration, it's really, it wasn't a gift to Black people to integrate. Integration was hard. It was not just hard for whites, it was hard for Blacks, right? They gave up their institutions. In the South, many Black teachers were fired or demoted. And you talk to women in my mother's generation, Black women in my mother's generation, and they will say, we had to do this. We had to do this to dismantle the apartheid system that we were living under. And when I say apartheid, I mean my mother grew up with the 2 water fountains and not being able to enter the library and those kinds of things. So she didn't see an alternative to dismantling that apartheid system, but they sent their babies off to those white schools the way you send a soldier to war. You know, it was for a better future, but it was not easy. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we have so much angst today, is that people today are saying, we gave up, you know, we gave up our own institutions, we gave up our control of our destiny in a way, and to join this white world. And now we're extra upset to feel like we still don't have a voice, like we still don't belong, like we're still guests or second-class citizens.
Because I think you've described a period where the Black schools were very strong and of great quality despite the economic inequity that existed.
I think we don't talk very much about that, but because the funding difference were so great. And in fact, the time you see Mississippi start to invest in its Black children was in the 40s, when the threat of integration starts coming. Then they start pouring more money into the Black system so that they can claim it's separate and equal. But, you know, Boston was a little different. Boston, there were so few Blacks in Boston in the 30s and 40s that you didn't have that many Black schools. Like Mel King went to an integrated school. Ruth Batson and Ellen Jackson, they went to Latin. They went to mostly predominantly white schools. But when you see this wave in the 60s and 70s come of the Great Migration, more people coming up from the South, and the Black population doubling and growing, and white people leaving the city, that's when you get this rapid growth in the number of segregated schools, because white people didn't want to be in schools. They were able to get transferred out. And so the interesting situation of the schooling in Boston, if you talk to Mel King, he will say, my white teachers didn't believe that I could achieve. It wasn't, they didn't believe in me. So he didn't have the experience that my mother had of having teachers that thought he could you know, get a master's degree or go on for higher education.
So I'm going to ask you in a second just about this backdrop of the early 20th century you know, you're pointing at demographic shifts and migratory experiences happening, which start to change Boston. So I think as we lead up to the 60s and 70s, we want to understand what's going on about that, because the demographics and housing and neighborhoods ultimately affects what happens on the education front. And just a note to our viewers, if you do have a question for Farah, please pop it in the Q&A section and we'll pick that up in a little bit. So Farah, back to you. Tell us what's going on migratory-wise, if you will, with the population in Boston leading up then to the 60s and 70s.
I think I actually have yeah, there you go. So I sort of made this graph. If you had more granular detail, you would see a pretty steep drop-off in 1974 when Garrity's decision happened. But basically, you know, white people were already moving out of the city into the suburbs in the 50s and 60s. But there is a pretty steep drop off in the 70s. From 1970 to 1980, Boston lost 27% of its white population.
And is this related to the busing crisis? Is this related to the Garrity decision? Is this economic change that had happened prior to this period?
I think so. I think from in the 50s and 60s, it's suburbanization. It happened all over the country. A lot of veterans returned. They got the GI Bill, and if they were able to move out of the city and into homes. And Black people, a lot of them were not able to move out of the city into homes. There were racial covenants that prevented them from buying houses in some of these suburbs. So you have the migratory pattern of whites out of the city, and then you have Blacks coming up from the South. And if you look at Ruth Batson's papers, you will find her talking about how shocked she was by some of these poor kids coming from the South who couldn't write their names, couldn't read or write. And so, and you can, this is almost totally lost, in the discussion of desegregation, but demographic changes matter. And so when these Black schools start filling up with kids from the South, even the Black families who lived in Boston and valued education tried to get out of those schools. And they couldn't, because the Boston school committee wouldn't let them transfer. And that's where you get Operation Exodus of Ellen Jackson raising money to bus kids from Roxbury to, the South End or other schools. And that's where you get Ruth Batson saying, how do we get our kids into schools in Newton and Brookline? And so there was a real desire among the educated Blacks in the city to do better for their kids. And they tried every means. So even if Mel King, for those of you who don't know Mel King, he's a legendary figure here in Boston and ran for mayor and is an activist and very respected. And I talked to him last week before this talk. He's 92, I think, at this point. But he said, he and his wife were part of this freedom school movement. And so in the 60s, when a lot of these Black families felt that the white teachers that were teaching their kids weren't doing right by them, they started their own schools. And so they had a network of schools run by Black parents. And Mel King actually tried to get funding for those schools that would have been community led. He said that the white teachers union at the time, turned him down. They didn't want to hire Black teachers, and they didn't want any of their resources to go to this community school led effort. And so the Garrity decision was kind of the NAACP lawsuit that brought on the Garrity decision was kind of the last resort after trying a lot of other things. And it almost, they were close to a deal on another solution, on redrawing the district lines and stuff like that. So it didn't have to come to that, but it did.
So we have then this case coming forward, Morgan v. Hannigan, which results ultimately in Garrity's decision. We have the Boston School Committee with one position. We have the Massachusetts State Board of Education with its policies. So there seem to be many sides to this question. Can you unpack that a little bit for us in a way that just allows us to see what are the competing interests? And I'm intrigued by the suggestion of an alternative solution that could have happened.
Well, they were looking at redrawing the district lines. So if you could have redrawn some of the neighborhood lines of schools so that they would foster integration. If you can gerrymander segregation, you can gerrymander integration, right? And they were working on that. They could have done that. But you had Louise Day Hicks, who was on the school committee. She was a really towering figure in Southie, and which is a heavily Irish part of town, part of Boston. And Boston, by the way, I think Boston has changed fundamentally as a city. Back then, it was a lot of ethnic enclaves, right? It wasn't just Blacks that were packed into a couple neighborhoods. You had Jewish neighborhoods. You had Irish. You had Italian. And, there were turf lines. You could get beat up if you crossed the wrong street. And I think one of the really good things to come out of the Garrity decision is that we became a more unified city because we had to. But yeah, before the Garrity decision, there was something called the Racial Imbalance Law that was passed, I think it was in 1965. And it was passed by the state. It was an attempt to get more integrated schools, but it basically said that any school that's more than 51% Black is imbalanced. So you can have a school that's 100% white and it's just fine. But if it's 61 or 51% Black, then there's a problem, and you have to, I mean, it was really a law that fell heavily on the cities, right? It fell heavily on Boston. And it really, when you look back and see them arguing over these quotas and percentages, like, how do you know that something's integrated, right? This is the difficulty under de facto segregation of the South. You were either not allowed to go to the school because you're Black, or, you know, it was pretty cut and dry, right? Could you go there or not? But in the North, you had a much more nebulous situation where you had a lot of schools had a couple Black kids, and then there were some schools that were heavily Black, and white kids were fleeing those schools. And so you see a lot of arguing. There's a lot of obsession at that time over what the proper percentage of Black kids in a school would be. And they were obsessed about that more than they obsessed about test scores. They obsessed about it the way we obsess about the MCAS today. And it was really, you know, at a certain point, you just have to think and say, what is this, you know, has this obsession with quotas gone a little overboard? But they, in order to measure integration, you have to define it, and you have to chart it.
And now we refer to this as the busing crisis rather than an integration crisis or some other characterization of this period, which the idea of busing as a means to bring this about becomes its own set of challenges and problems. Can you unpack that a little for us?
Well, I think, right. So Boston today, I think we spend like 100 million still on
it's a lot. I mean, I think we'll stipulate it's a lot.
A lot. So what Garrity's decision essentially did was, Southie was the only school, or one of the only schools, that was 100% white, the high school. And Roxbury was 100% Black, if not close to it. And Garrity basically said, he took the high schoolers in Southie and assigned them to Roxbury, and took the Roxbury Black kids and assigned them to Southie. And it was, you know, this famous moment when you saw people in Southie line up, they're hurling rotten eggs and racial slurs, and there are cops accompanying these buses, and these kids just like walk into this very traumatic situation where they are sent essentially across enemy lines. And there was a historic animosity too, that beyond racism, which was clearly there, but there was also a historic kind of animosity between these two neighborhoods. And it caused just years of resistance and turmoil, from which Boston, in some cases, in some ways, you can say we haven't actually come back from it, because Boston has 55,000 kids in its public school system today. Less than 8,000 of them are white. So, you know, Garrity just assigned them to Roxbury, and half of the kids would just not show up. A lot of them dropped out of school. Like, some of them moved away, many of them moved away. And it was, if you look back, you can say, you know, people at the time felt it was punitive. They felt it was personal. They were going after Southie. They were going after Louise Day Hicks' stronghold and teaching them a lesson. And so you just wonder, could we have done the same, you know, could we, you know, the decision was important, it was necessary, it was brave in so many ways, and yet the implementation of it, and, you know, may have been doomed to fail, because if you look at the integration plans that worked, and if you say just on their own merits of preserving integration and exposure across race lines over time, they are schools where white people are not inconvenienced. right? Where you send a small number of Black people on a bus to a white school, that can last, right? But inconveniencing white people, sending them to the Black school, yeah, that's what, it's Southie's resistance was famous, but in general, it was the huge opposition came from whites being assigned to Black schools.
Well, I sincerely hope that inconveniencing white people is not one of the criteria for success on this front. But we have lots of questions on that side. We're also talking just about the public schools, right? We're not talking about the school system as a whole. There's the Medco dimension that's in the background of this too, that I think is worth
Right.
spending a moment on.
Yes, of course. So Medco is a voluntary program. It's still in existence. A lot of Boston's leaders, including Kim Janey, went through Medco. So Kim Janey is interesting. She started at a freedom school, Black community-led freedom school. Then she was bused to Charleston, and in the 70s, I believe. And then she went to, I think, Reading through Metco, a suburban high school. So she's seen it all, right? And I would say that one of the reasons Metco didn't face opposition and still is a popular program is that, it's the most motivated families, right? It's the families that are super, you have to really want an education to sit on that bus for 2 hours a day and go out to the suburbs. You really have to want it. And so, those kids that are really struggling, the homeless kids, the kids who may have a parent who's incarcerated, like those are not kids that are getting on the bus to go to school in Lexington. But in general, it's more middle-class Black families that have the Medco option. And so I think, that's another thing to really consider is that in general, the Black families that have been able to really take advantage of these opportunities to integrate are the ones who have the most resources, and they're the most well-off and the most motivated. There's the strivers. And so you leave behind a school district that is, that you've creamed off the top, right? You've taken those families out of that school district and left it even more bereft. And so I think what I've come to is that you have to give families options for integrated education, but you can't have that be your only tool. And you have to provide more resources to those schools that are left behind, because there are always going to be kids left behind.
So it comes back to economics in part as well, and that you can't solve the education inequity without looking at the economic injustices.
I really feel that healthy schools are part of healthy communities. And if you tell a community, hey, your school cannot be a good school because it has too many kids in it that look like you. Like that's, what kind of message does that send? So I do think we have to revisit the way we fund schools. We have to revisit the notion that a school in the middle of a city can't be a good school. We know what it takes to educate those kids. If you look at Orchard Gardens, it's a public school that every few years it seems to get turnaround money, right? We give it millions of dollars and then magically it's able to improve dramatically. And then once it does, what do? We take the money away, right? Epiphany School, it's a private school, but it serves, it raises private money, and then it serves, some of the toughest kids in Boston. And it has great results, but it spends huge amounts of money on those kids. And so I just think, we know how to get those results. We just don't know where the money is going to come from.
Just before we open it up to questions from our audience tonight, just two topics to pick up. One is how would you characterize now, I mean, the legacy of busing and this integration period? As we were chatting earlier, it's not just about the 1974 decision itself, but Garrity himself was continuing to intervene and make additional rulings right up to 1988, which is, that's 32 years ago. So that's, I'll speak for myself, people my age, a little bit older, a little bit younger, you know, dealing with that legacy. But what, Farah, as you look in at this, what are your thoughts on the legacy of this from maybe from a positive point of view and maybe from a continuing challenge point of view?
I mean, I feel like the decision did some really great things. It forced the city to hire Black teachers, for one. You know, Garrity's micromanaging got a lot of resources where to kids who wouldn't have otherwise had it. I mean, school desegregation, at the end of the day, it's a tool. It's one of many tools. And it was a tool to get resources into the classrooms that had Black kids in it. And I think one of the things we have to ask ourselves now as a society is, do we accept that in order for Black kids to have resources in their classroom, they have to be sitting next to white ones? Do we accept that proposition? Or are we willing to fund schools full of poor Black kids? Are we willing to value those schools the same way we value schools full of white kids from middle-class families? And if we do, how are we going to fund that? Right now, property taxes, you know, a lot of countries don't fund their education system out of property taxes, but this is the way we fund it. So we literally have baked into the system this notion that rich people are going to go to rich schools and poor people are going to go to poor schools because that's property tax. That's property taxes. So I think there's a lot of exciting things we could do to sort of pull at that question of, how do you fund education, and do you fund education for poor Black kids and Hispanic kids and poor kids in general?
We've come back to this equity equality distinction, and at the opening comments, I think you mentioned a cartoon that Kim Janey had shared with you at some point. I think we have an image of that. Maybe you could talk a little bit about why that struck you so much and how it applies to this situation more than we already have.
Let's see the image if we've got it queued up.
There we go.
Right. So one of the things people talk about since integration is kind of faded. Desegregation, integration have sort of faded in the lingo. We're not seeing these court cases anymore. The Supreme Court has kind of turned against this, and so as a tool, this is going away. But a lot of people talk about equity now, and equity means, to me, it means giving more resources where they're needed. And so, I mean, if you think about it, Boston doesn't do such a bad job in that I think we spend $1 billion, a billion with a B, on education in the city of Boston. I mean, it is expensive to educate kids who are coming from places where they might not speak English as a first language, places where their parents might be holding down 3 and 4 jobs just to survive. And so getting really good outcomes from those kids does mean spending more money. I think in a middle-class environment, you know, maybe, you know, kids are going to get by whether they go to summer camp or not. But I think those opportunities, summer camps, summer schools, prep, test prep, all of those things are really, really important in a city.
And of course, I think there are different takes on that original cartoon as well, which there's another, I mean, any representation is going to be an oversimplification of the issue. I will grant you that, but there's one that suggests, why don't you just take the wall out of the equation completely? But also a simplification.
Well, yes, but walls, what purpose do walls serve? They serve a purpose, right? It's whoever is putting on that baseball game is maybe charging a fee to get inside. And I mean, what are school districts except but walls, right? So I mean, look at the city of Brookline. It was right smack in the middle of Boston, right? But those property taxes and those property values are so high because you know that when you send your child to school, they're going to school in Brookline. That's a tiny school district of what, 8,000 kids? And so, I mean, when we talk about ways to increase access to education, one of the strategies is to have fewer school districts, because the very reason those school districts exist is to put up a wall so that those on the other side can't come in, and you are assured that you know, the only people here are those who can really really afford it, right? And I just want to say that as great as I think METCO is, it would be awesome if all those towns that accept, you know, like a couple dozen Black kids from Boston, it would be great if they made affordable housing inside their towns so that people could actually afford to live there. And so, I mean, we just have to really think more about why walls are there, and whether there are ways to chip away at those walls that are keeping folks from opportunity.
I mean, that suggests a more regional-based approach rather than following the strict town, city, district lines, which we're also seeing dialogue on around with housing and transportation and transit systems.
Yeah.
So that applies to education too.
I know we want to head to, like, I think there's some good questions coming up, but I just wanted to say that the most segregated school system in the country, and I'm not just talking racially, but socioeconomically, are places that have a lot of school districts. So Long Island has something like 127 school districts. That's like what a school district for every mile of Long Island. So every group of people that wants to, you know, they want to have their wall off their little school and have it only be their tax base and only fund the kids in their neck of the woods. If we really wanted to make our school system more equitable, every county, it would be a countywide. And that's where you've seen sort of lasting gains of integration programs, and are places where they were geographically large and where people couldn't just, you know, slip across the border here or there to kind of shield themselves from the riffraff.
So we've characterized, I think, the discussion so far in terms of the impacts on Black communities, white communities. Peggy asks if we could talk a little bit about the role of Hispanics in the desegregation case, and Carmen Pola as one figure in that case, if you're familiar with her, but the Hispanic intervention in the case itself.
I found this fascinating because in the middle of the Garrity case, the Hispanics in Boston had literally just won the right to bilingual education as soon as the Garrity case came. And so Black people were like clamoring to get into these white schools. And Hispanic people were like, oh no, we're cool over here. we just organized our own classroom with our own bilingual teacher. And so they were actually upset about, they didn't want to draw from a lottery. And so they actually worked out a separate deal that respected the rights that they had won to get bilingual education. But it's getting, this leads us to the future and the question of where we are now as a country, because demographic changes are really important. And by the way, we're in the middle of a huge demographic change. And today, public school, in public schools today, whites are already a minority. So this notion that we can integrate, then integration means just sprinkling a few Black kids in a big pot of white people, that's not happening in most of these cities. And it's not happening because there aren't enough white babies to do that. And so, and the number of Hispanics, I think if you look at Lowell, and Lawrence, there are school districts that are like 80 and 90% Hispanic. So what does integration mean in that context? So it just gets much more complicated when you talk about being a multiracial society. We're not a black and white society anymore. And so even when we talk about, there was so much bending over backwards in the 70s to define it and measure it and figure out if we were achieving it. Now it's much more complicated. And so I just think we've got to get a lot more creative and think really about who we want to be as a society. What is the goal here? I think one of the great questions here is integration for integration's sake a worthwhile goal? And that is an excellent question, because it's one that I wrestled with so much. Yeah. Because on the one hand, I believe that we want a society where people know how to live, work, and play together. And you learn that in school a lot. On the other hand, I have an example of my mother who came from a place that was as segregated as could be. And yet it imbued her with such a sense of self-worth that she could walk forth into and so I don't think we can have a one-size-fits-all solution.
The question of choice throughout this controversy becomes interesting. I think BPS today, the school choice options, which continue to evolve, want to preserve some of the values of this this trajectory, but at the same time not sacrifice choice. Is this something that's still trying to find the right balance, do you think? Is there more to go?
So it's interesting, the school choice. So I will just, this is where I kind of come out. Even my high school, which was overwhelmingly white when I went there, my part of Michigan where I grew up has gone to a school choice plan. And they did it. I don't know if they did it out of the goodness of their heart or if they did it because there weren't enough kids in East Lansing proper anymore, and the enrollment was going down. But anyway, they had space, and so they invited school choice. Kids from predominantly Black Lansing can come now to East Lansing High School if there's space. And it was not billed as a desegregation program, but that's the effect. And so on the one hand, it's wonderful for these families in Lansing who are super motivated, again, like the Medco families. They're willing to travel, they're willing to make the sacrifice and get their child to this school in another town. But who are they leaving behind? You're taking these well-resourced, motivated Black families from Lansing, and you're giving them to a school district that already is doing okay. And so that's why I'm saying, whenever you have a choice plan, you have to have a plan for those who get left behind, right? The ones who are left, because there are always those who are left. And so, and I think it's a metaphor for integration itself, because integration itself allowed those Black people who had education, a little bit of money, something, to go into the white world and leave the Black community behind. So the doctors and the bankers and everybody who used to be forced to live all in the bounds of Roxbury, now they can live anywhere they want, and they leave behind those who are, who have the least. And so it's really a struggle. You still have to talk about what is left behind and what are the mechanisms for providing enough resources for those who are left behind.
So, I think there's a couple of questions that have come in about people who lived through this and, either moved out or chose Medco or had other options. And tying this to academic performance, do we have any data about how different experiences lead to different academic results? And is that the right metric anyway? Should it be academic performance? Should it be success later in life? Should it be I don't know, some form of measure of integration, whatever that would look like. What are your thoughts on that?
So there's a guy named Rutgers, I believe. He's done some serious long studies. He's really like over many decades, where he's looked at places that had desegregation orders. And he found that on so many measures, their academic performance, their lifespan, um, job prospects, like on all kinds of levels, kids, Black people under desegregation orders did better, and without a measurable impact on white people in those places. And so he has some pretty compelling evidence that in general, this school desegregation worked over a long term. But I think he would also say that funding is part of it, because if you look at places that simply integrated, but they didn't add any funding, they didn't get those same results. And so I think one of the problems with the Garrity decision is it sent poor Black kids to school in a poor white neighborhood, and then it sent poor white kids to school in a poor Black neighborhood, and all of the well-off liberals clapped and said, success. But in fact, it was a very socioeconomically segregated solution. I mean, if you just take those two schools, right? Southie wasn't, I think, Southie was at one time home to the poorest white population outside of Appalachia. I mean, it was poor, it was filled with public housing. And so the notion, I mean, socioeconomic integration has also skyrocketed, or socioeconomic segregation has also skyrocketed in our school system. It's also really important. And you can find schools, districts in upstate New York, where, they're right next to each other, or in Ohio, or they're right next to each other. And we're talking white kids, where the per pupil difference is enormous. And so I don't know if I'm ranting at this point, but I think you have to fix funding, and you have to be clear-eyed about the goal. I do think integration is a great goal, but I don't think it's the only goal or even the most important goal. I think providing quality education and loving environments to Black children and Hispanic children and Asian children and white children, but that's what it was about. And we can't lose sight of it. People talk about integration as a form of reparations. It's not reparations. A seat in a white school doesn't pay back the Black person who was supposed to get the benefits of the GI Bill and didn't because he was Black. Give him his check. And then he can take his child wherever he wants to school, because they'll have the money to do that. I mean, I think we just have to be a little bit more clear-eyed about what we are talking about integration achieving. And I also think that we put so much on schools. We want them to fix all social problems, but we don't give them all that much resources, right? So, I mean, we want them to fix our segregated housing and all of, incarceration. All of it ends up in schools, and it's a lot to expect out of them.
Without more resources, or without the right resources.
Right.
We've talked a good bit about Southie and specific neighborhoods. There's one question in the chat about blockbusting and Mattapan and Dorchester in particular. I'm just wondering, not only what are the impacts of some of the activities around this time on other suburbs, but then I'd like to extend it out to the state as well, because Massachusetts is certainly one zone for this purpose, but probably outweighed by the sheer size of the Boston School District for this conversation. So thoughts on other neighborhoods in Boston?
Oh, can you read the question?
Yeah, and I'm not sure I'm getting all of the content of this, but the question is, how significant was the blockbusting that occurred in Mattapan and Dorchester in explaining white flight to the suburbs and then the current racial composition of Mattapan and Dorchester?
Oh, it's a great question. I suspect the person who asks it knows the answer. So as I understand it, and this is a little out of my purview, but Mattapan was a largely Jewish area. And I think when people talk about blockbusting, what I think they mean is a Black person would buy a house on that block, and then sometimes unscrupulous realtors, sometimes just neighbors, whatever, would sort of fearmonger and say your housing values are going to go down. You better sell your house. And I also think there were federal programs that helped Black people buy homes in Mattapan, but it basically changed that neighborhood changed from being the sort of heart of the Jewish community to now being a largely Black community where it's a great neighborhood if you go there now as well. But yeah, I think, demographic change happens and public policies can encourage it or discourage it. And I think there's no question that some of those loan programs did accelerate the flight of Jewish people out of Mattapan. And there were, I think my old colleague at the Boston Globe wrote a whole book about that. So I defer to him.
And then I think that the related question that I was hinting at earlier is the Garrity's decision's impact on the rest of Massachusetts, which would be indirect, I assume, but maybe not.
Well, here's something people in Boston should know. Garrity's decision and everything that happened after it impacted the entire country, because in hundreds of lawsuits all across the United States, when a school district tried to defend itself from desegregation orders, they called in an expert witness from Boston named Christine Russell, who basically said, here's what happened in Boston. Don't do it here. And Christine Russell is an interesting person because she actually, when she was young and in graduate school, she was in charge of helping to implement the decision. And she really thought it was, she was very idealistic and believed in it. And then when she saw she saw the loss of the white students from the school system, she said, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. How can you integrate a system and then when you're also simultaneously chasing these white kids away? So Garrity would assign a bunch of kids from Southie to Roxbury, only half would show up. Then he'd assign a bunch more, only half would show up. And in the end, you don't have very many white kids left in your system. And so Boston is a cautionary tale that changed the way school desegregation cases all across the country were done, because people said, you can't do this and expect to keep your white kids in the system. So then you move to like school choice plans, and you move to magnet schools, and you move to all kinds of different solutions that are more voluntary than what Garrity did. I'm like distracted by reading some of these great questions.
Feel free, if there's one that caught your eye that you'd like to respond to, go right ahead.
Well, somebody mentions Susan Collins. Hello, Susan. She said, you live in Cambridge. How do you think Cambridge public schools compared to Boston on integration? So Cambridge has a socioeconomic integration plan, which is really interesting. It only has one high school, so which has both, kind of vocational tech. It has, Cambridge Region Latin puts a lot of money into students, and they try hard. I mean, Cambridge does try hard. And besides the fact that they have a lot of affordable housing around. So I think Cambridge has actually come up with a really interesting model, and there are a lot of school districts around the country that are models at how to continue to try having diversity, socioeconomic and racial diversity, in a way without a court case. And I think maybe we'll share some links with you if you want to read about what other people are doing around the country. I encourage you to do that, because there's a lot of solutions that people are coming up with. I will say about Cambridge that at the end of the day, if I've met a lot of lovely people who are liberal and well off, who try a public school and then they take their kid out because it's just not for them. They just don't, they didn't get the school they wanted. It's too far away. And, Cambridge is one of those places that's full of people that have options. They have other options. And so I'm sure every year people move out of the city or send their kid to private school because they didn't get the school they wanted down the street. And that's, any school district is going to have to face that. Because people with money have options. They just do. And so that's kind of, but you know what? Guess what? They still pay property taxes in Cambridge, and that money still goes in the public schools, and that public schools are still investing in kids. And so I think at the end of the day, you still get, I think Cambridge spends more than $20,000 a year on its students. And it's a lot of money that Cambridge puts in education, and it's a good school district.
When I talk to colleagues, and this is on that point, they all come back to suggesting that the best way to combat that problem is by making every school desirable in its own right, or successful in its own right. Pipe dream, or back to the funding issue?
I don't think it's a pipe dream. I mean, I think if you talk to parents around the city, parents want to send their kids to schools nearby. They tend to want, even people who live in a public housing development. You will find them wanting to send their kid to a school nearby if they think it's safe. And so I don't know if it's a pipe dream or not, but like, if you look at schools that really meet the needs of kids who are really struggling, they have washing machines in those schools, right? If you're a homeless kid, you might need a washing machine in your school. If you look at the kinds of supports that some schools can put into not just kids but families, right? There's a lot of creative things that could be done if schools were made into resources for their communities, and if they had more community trust. So people always say you can't scale up the Harlem Children's Zone model. But I love the Harlem Children's Zone model because it invests not just in those kids, but in their families. And it doesn't tell them you have to get on a bus and go 2 hours away to get a good education, because your community right here is worthy of investment. Your community right here has resources, and they find a way to make it work. And there was a time there was somebody in Boston trying to replicate that model here. I don't know if it happened. But I really think that kids need different stuff. They don't all need the same thing, and parents who have multiple kids know that. So I'm not sure there's a one size fits all approach for education that's going to get us there.
I do think the value of the local is certainly one that is shared, and being able to maybe even walk to school or bike to school, like I certainly did growing up, although that was in Dublin at a time when we were a 98% white nation. That's no longer the case, different experience. But what's interesting about busing as a solution, or as a proposed solution, was because the neighborhoods were not mixed or integrated. And so if the neighborhoods were a more integrated society and reflective of that, local would be fine from the point of view of what busing was trying to solve.
I, I'm reading some of these questions. Do you mind if I run through a couple of them?
Go for it. We have about 10 minutes left. So if there's a couple that have caught your eye that I haven't gotten to, please go right ahead.
I'm going to see see if I can get through as many. How did Common Ground by Anthony Lucas affect perceptions and memories of school integration? Did the book still come up in conversations about busing? I certainly read it. A lot of people did. There are a lot of Black people who are angry about the book because they thought that, for instance, there's no mention of Ruth Batson. So he didn't really focus on the Black activists and the work that Black activists did to get to the Garrity decision. So that there's some angry words about that. Let's see. Here in New York, advocates for equity are striving to end the academic admission screens that many schools use as a way to maintain racial segregation without having to outright say it, that they don't want their kids attending schools with Black and brown kids. What are your thoughts about the ways coded language and coded policies have played into racial segregation, and what are the ways to dismantle it? Hi, Rachel Posner. It's a great question, and I think it speaks to the fact that some parents, some white parents who are have means are saying, you know what, I don't want my kid going to such a segregated school, and we're going to work to dismantle these admissions policies. And I think in New York, we've seen several schools work to change those admissions policies. And I think if you are a white and well-resourced parent, you are you're well positioned to advocate at your school for things like setting aside a certain number of seats for economically disadvantaged students, for getting rid of sort of coded tests that are kind of these gatekeeper issues. And I think we've seen some interesting parent coalitions even here in Boston that have been exciting and worthwhile. I just want to say that you can also have a school that is integrated, but 40% of the Black boys are in special ed and all the white kids are in advanced placement classes. And so that's integration under one roof, but what message does that send? And so I really think, it's not easy. It's hard work, and it continues to be hard work. You have a lot of white people moving back to the city, and some of them are putting their kids in public schools. And then you have the issue of, how do parents interact? And do the white parents get their way while the Black parents are not heard? And so integration shouldn't just mean we're in the same classroom together, but are we creating an environment where the white parent and the Black parent are both listened to?
Well, this just reminds me that trying to solve one aspect of racial inequity or economic inequity in isolation from all the others is never going to push us across the finish line.
It's hard work. It's hard. You have to just keep at it. I think, I'm encouraged by this situation we're in right now, where people are feeling energized and they're feeling that change is possible. And that's great. That's when big things can happen.
And as someone who has followed this topic for several years, does this moment feel different to you? And if so, why?
I will just say that in 2014, when Trayvon Martin was killed, every Black person I knew was watching the verdict to see what happened to George Zimmerman. And pretty much every white person I knew was tweeting a picture of the delicious hamburger they were about to eat. Like, they just weren't paying attention. It wasn't on their radar screen. And now when I drive by Black Lives Matter protests in my community or in Arlington right next door, like, there are big protests and there's not a single Black face. So at least in this part of the country, I sense an openness to to really wrestling with the issues and to saying we want to work on it and we want to listen. And I think that's hopeful. I don't know if that's happening all over the country, but it's happening here.
Well, the protests seem to be happening all over the country on a sustained basis. It has reminded me a little bit of what we saw around gun violence activism or gun control activism after Parkland. It's not any of these analogies are going to fail ultimately. I grant you that. But equally around some of the climate change work, that we have a large number of young people involved, which seems to be on a sustaining basis, and they themselves are diverse. I don't want to read too much into that because only time will tell. At the end of the day, actions and change are what matter more than conversation and words.
I mean, I do think there's something about schools that's so personal, and parents can be involved, right? They can be involved, you know, a healthy school has active parents. And I think that's one of the reasons it's healthy for school systems to have parents saying, okay, what about emissions policies? How can I make sure that not just my child, but everybody in the school or everybody in the school district has a better shot? And parents' advocacy does matter. Parents raise money for their children's public schools all the time. In Boston, it's sort of embarrassing how much some schools rely on private donations, because not every school has that donor base. But there are ways that those private donations could be shared more equitably. There's always something you can do. So I think the gun issue and climate change, they can feel so huge, but schools actually, you know, there are small things that are hopeful that individuals can do. I do want to, there's a couple more. Somebody said, can you talk about magnet schools as a vehicle for parents to choose to send their children to integrated schools that had racial goals, aka quotas? Yeah, I think there still are. Hartford is a great example of a city that has made a huge effort. I think that was because Connecticut if I remember correctly, has a right to equal education written into its constitution. So they were able to bring a lawsuit that actually forced the state to put a lot of money into schools, and they created this amazing schools with planetariums and all kinds of stuff that would then attract, you know, these white people from the suburbs and get that buy-in. And I think, you know, maybe 40% of kids in Hartford get to go to a school like that. So it's better than 10%. But you know, magnet schools, again, it's the same situation. We create these islands of excellence, and then, you know, we still have to make a plan for those who don't get in, because there's always, unfortunately, there always seem to be people that are left outside.
Is there, we're nearly at time. If there's one more question you've spotted you'd like to answer yourself before I ask my final question, please go right ahead.
So someone says, what alternative would you recommend to funding public education from property taxes, and what would it take to get it done politically? It's a great question. I will say that in Massachusetts here, we have something like, it's a funding formula. Some of it's, you know, a big chunk is property taxes, but then the state kind of tops up the poorer communities. And so it's not straight property taxes in Massachusetts, and in much of the country, they have sort of these formulas that make it a little more equitable. But I do think that, you know, if we are in a big moment right now, if we're in sort of a New Deal moment where we're all suffering, there's COVID, there's an economic, you know, we're high unemployment rate, like everyone is suffering. And so in a way, this is a moment where maybe we can make big changes because we all are feeling vulnerable. And maybe that's why we're having this racial reckoning right now. And so, you know, what is the shoot for the moon goal? to get more funding into schools and into schools that need it the most. You know, I think it's really something worth talking about and worth discovering. But politically, how do you get it done politically? I mean, you organize. You organize.
I know have a couple of teachers who are attending tonight and watching, and at least one has asked if this will be recorded and made available because they'd like to show it to their students at a later date. So yes, it will be made available. And Farah, I'm just wondering, because some students at some point will be watching this if we don't have any on tonight yet, what would your closing comments or words be to the students who are currently in school? Either on education generally or on this topic? What would you want to say to them?
Well, you guys are the most diverse generation. You are, I'm in awe of what young people do every day, because they really have, they really seem to have a vision of what the world could be, in a way that I think those of us who've seen the failures of the past might get tired. And so I kind of I want to apologize to young people, because we're not living here a world that's in great shape right now. But I'm inspired by their vision and by their refusal to accept. By their refusal to accept less. And I just want to say that, you know, my mother's generation is full of people who were willing to work twice as hard for half as much and still be whispered about as an affirmative action case, right? Young people today are not having it. They're not hearing it. They're like, I don't, you know, we're not going to, we don't have to be perfect to be valued. We shouldn't have to, we shouldn't have to prove our worth every second of every day. And we want a voice. And I think at the end of the day, that's a good thing. It's an inspiring thing.
Farah, thank you so much for joining us this evening, for sharing your work and your personal thoughts and history on this very important topic and at this very important moment. Our thanks also go to the WGBH Forum Network, the Lowell Institute, and our dedicated BPL production staff for helping put tonight's program on.